industry. A lot of people, they start in industry in cybersecurity, they go into the more academic roles or doing a PhD, then go back to industry with kind of a new set of more specialized skills. And from the people I've talked to is that you can really get into more senior roles if you do have that experience, because you have a bit more independence in the project you're taking. Additionally, a lot of the universities that do post CDTs or individual projects have a lot of really strong industry links as well. The program I'm on is like University of Bristol and Bath, and they essentially have these sandpits where you have to essentially go out to industry and like kind of pitch yourself a bit, and they give you a bit of a project for a few weeks. And so you kind of do get those industry connections. For the most part, if you're doing more of an individual project, it's usually fairly specific. You have to reach out and make those links yourself, essentially. But yeah, no, I think, what is that like? Do you want to become like a security researcher, or is it like more of just a general passion for it?
General passion. I mean, I'm not too deep into it.
Yeah.
I don't know yet.
No, that's fine. I really wasn't until like last year, until I just kind of was like, fuck it, I'll help the Cybersecurity Society last year, and now Maxine's running it this year, which is it's very cool.
It's nice, but yeah, I remember we weren't talking a lot about cybersecurity in second year, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Did you do placement here, or no? You went straight for the PhD?
Yeah. So a lot of people kind of have the conception that you need to do a master's before a PhD. It's not. You can't just go from a bachelor's straight to a PhD. It's all about just kind of racking up the experience a bit. I will go through these slides real quick because it kind of makes my point a little bit more specific. Actually, sorry, I'll actually go through to the people except like, why are you kind of more interested in doing a PhD, or like just generally?
It's not specifically in cybersecurity. It's
right.
just computing in general.
Oh, fair.
It's more. I'm not sure whether I want to be an academic or not.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, that's fair. Because I have like a fair bit of general advice in here as well. I've already spoken to you a little bit as well. And so we'll kind of just go a little bit. First, this is me. I was essentially just studied like a bachelor's extra. Then I just applied to, I was very lucky personally. I found this really good program, which is from Universities of Bath and Bristol, where they were able to essentially create a multidisciplinary cybersecurity degree. So it would combine the technical aspects with the human aspects of cybersecurity. This was the first one I applied to, so it was a shock to get in. But I'll kind of continue, and like going over to actually why you would want to do a PhD in the first place. These are fairly like generic points, but I think it's quite important that first you have like a deep curiosity in the subject that goes into the points of you want to more so explore the edges of the topic. With a degree like a master's, it's usually you'll get to a point where you've read a lot, but because it's only 1 or 2 years, you can't read enough for you to actually produce a project which is addressing the fundamental research gaps of the topic. And so with a PhD, you really just have those 3 or 4 years to explore. I think there's also the idea of actually making a positive difference. When going into industry, you can definitely make like a big difference in the company, but sometimes you don't really get the wider societal changes that you want. With creating a PhD project, you can innovate responsibly and go and essentially address policy changes as well in the government by and in that sense it can generally have like a wider impact. There's also, you do tend to have an independence in your work, but it depends what kind of supervisor you have. If you have a supervisor that's very hands-on, you might be pushed more towards an area. You can also do PhDs with industry as well. So industry will fund that PhD, although again, you'll have less independence with your work. So it really is like a game of like, do you want these very specific milestones in your PhD, or is it more so you just you've got a project, you've got your site set, and you just need someone to guide you a bit. There's also a project you can be proud of, like how you can, it's with industry, it's like you're kind of creating something for someone else. With this, you're essentially creating something in a topic that you've found just specifically interesting. And then obviously there's the industry skills of actually having more specialized skills, and you can go into incredibly untapped areas as well, which wouldn't necessarily be that valuable as in terms of like short-term company goals. But because you get to potentially decide your project, you can go for something that might help long-term. So like a field like marketing or such. So I've got quite a big slide on CDTs because personally I think they're the best. So CDT stands for the Center for Doctoral Training. That's the program that I'm currently on. And it's essentially training someone to be a doctor. So you get valuable like research skills. There are other CDTs that exist in computer science, I believe. You can just kind of search that up. But there's a few that exist for cybersecurity as well. Essentially, it gives you an extra year to find your niche within the subject. You can explore in a lot more detail over this year. You can network with like specific supervisors and industry partners. It essentially gives you an extra year to figure out what you're going to do. Like I said, I work in like a specific cohort. So I can essentially work together with people to see what other people are interested in. And this really helps, especially if you want to go further into academia, because you can get papers published with those connections that you've made. However, the CDTs aren't necessarily for everyone. If you already have a predefined project that you have in your head, it's not necessarily going to be the most needed. And you can just apply to a specific university. So there's predefined projects and that universities can just set out on their website listings. But there's also projects which you have to create yourself and you have to propose to a potential supervisor. So this would just be emailing certain faculty members on computer science or cybersecurity backgrounds. And I think I'll talk a little bit more about supervisors. Let's specifically go to the funding. So the way it's usually funded is through EPSRC, which is the main UK funding body for like PhD projects. As you can see, for home students, the minimum stipend is usually pretty low. It can get higher than that, but it's also tax-free, so you may want to find other work as well. Although, so through teaching associate work, you can essentially do some work within the university that still is tangentially related to your degree to essentially make the stipend like a little bit more manageable. However, I wouldn't expect to do too many more hours than what you've already got, because it can be really pressuring to have more of the associations. Specifically, why doing a PhD in cyber? These are kind of the like we're fucked slides, you know, where it's like there's such kind of fundamental issues with the industry, where in the there's like fundamental issues with the industry. So, for example, with like the British Library incident, there was mainly an issue with them having a lot of legacy systems that hackers were just able to exploit. And the impact of these damages, for example, with JLR, is $485 million. I have a friend who worked for JLR during this thing, and like he just couldn't get to work. Like he was just completely done for like a few weeks. And it's still not like fully back. And I think the reason why there's kind of interest in research is that you can advise industry to make better decisions. You know, a lot of the time people kind of claim academia is like very theory-based, and it is. There's not always these realistic approaches, but you can kind of change the systems with your project, essentially. So you can create your own methods for creating a more secure world. I realize I'm being a bit slow here, so I will try and speed up. Let's just go into specific topics, because I want to kind of highlight that with cybersecurity, there's a very interdisciplinary nature to it. So it's not just things like ICS and OT and Internet of Things security, where it's very cyber-physical and it's very technical and stuff like cryptography. But one thing that I found very interesting was one of the PhD projects was cybersecurity representations in media. So it would look at shows like Mr. Robot and say, well, how accurately is this being defined? And although this doesn't necessarily have that many tangible impacts, it essentially gives an awareness of how to improve representation of cybersecurity in the future, which helps to engage with the general public, which I think is very interesting. And then there's also usable security, where you're actually creating security that works with the users. Whereas people always say that like humans are the weakest link in cybersecurity, but if we don't create systems that work well with humans, then what do we really expect, you know? Kind of going over some like example papers that I found really interesting, that I think when you're doing your dissertations and literature reviews can get quite boring to get into very like small papers. This one's a really interesting one. This one's about how websites like used to track you through very nefarious means. So, for example, there's this idea called canvas fingerprinting, where it was able to websites essentially get the configurations of your browser. They write a bunch of hidden text on the screen. They take a screenshot of that, and they measure these tiny differences to fingerprint you. And this was the first study to actually show that this was available in practice. So it was a very interesting read. And it was really showing how like these very shady websites were using it to track the users. And it described a bunch of different ways in which they would track you, not just through fingerprinting, but through a combination of techniques. Similarly, with this is supposedly a less technical paper, and it's more so about cryptocurrency giveaway scams. This is more, I guess, the human aspects of cybercrime, where essentially there's scams on things like YouTube videos or like tweets, where they'll post something like, free Bitcoin giveaway. You just send me 1 Bitcoin and I'll send you 1,000 if you win. And like that complete scam. So you're able to analyze the blockchain to figure out how well these actually convert. This is a slightly smaller paper, and there are actually problems with it. But through going through your PhD, you're able to research and really critically think, well, like what are the bad parts of this paper as well? There's a lot of issues with papers that you can kind of see once you start reading in properly and you actually find the subject really interesting. So in the CDT we're doing, we have to give presentations on each of these papers every week or so. So we have to really dig deep and figure out what are the methodological flaws that could pervade these papers. So I kind of wanted to also just go through the PhD versus master's dynamic, because I've kind of already mentioned this, to be fair, but with the PhD, you're going to the edge of the knowledge, you're finding fundamental research gaps, you're networking with people, and you can get like a very large encompassing of your niche area. I spoke to a few of the professors and research associates, and they said, and I don't think this is necessarily true, but they said that by the time you finish your degree, you're kind of in a selection where you're in such a specific field that there's only a handful of people that really know what you're doing. And so when you go to these conferences, you kind of have to engage with people in the way that like you need to find the people that actually understand what you're doing, because there's not that many of them. Whereas with a master's project, it's usually a little bit smaller, and you can kind of, you can improve some of the areas of the subject, but you just don't have the time. So where to find a PhD? There's a lot of really good places. Personally, my mum texted me the PhD program from findthephd.com, and I was like, this looks good. And I applied, and then I got in. It was great. Find the PhD is a really good resource because it essentially lists via the field. A lot of the time with PhD projects, there's not always an off season. There's times where it's like a little bit more busy, but oftentimes there's going to be like consistently churned out other than when the university is restarting. But you can really apply like at any point. It just depends on the specific overlap. So if you're doing a master's, there may be an overlap to a PhD. There's also the website listings. University of Exeter actually has a really good resource on giving a lot of predefined topics. You can also, so in terms of funding, oftentimes if you just email a professor with a project proposal, make sure when emailing a professor you're not cold emailing or anything. You email them a proposal or your ideas and you work with them showing that you've got a lot of passion for the subject. Oftentimes they will find funding for you, even if it's partial funding. It's usually really helpful if you have those professors on your team because they have connections, and if they really want to work with you, then they'll find a way. There's also jobs at ac.uk, but like a lot of job listing sites, you can find places, but sometimes they're not necessarily what you're looking for. Sometimes they'll be overbooked. I think oftentimes, despite me, saying findthephd.com is good, actually going directly to your university with people you already have some level of research experience with can be a more useful option. Actually, picking a supervisor is, I got quite a bit of time. Picking a supervisor, I've heard from a lot of different professors recently that it can sometimes be as important as choosing your project, which kind of doesn't feel like it should make sense. But if you have a bad supervisor relationship, then first you're going to be stuck them for 3 years, as long as you don't ditch them, which you absolutely should. And it can just make your life completely miserable and you just don't want to do the project because you don't want to work with this professor. And it'll be kind of the same with the professor. I have heard sometimes what they do to PhD students they don't like. They just sometimes, but specifically, you want to essentially be direct with them, see like what their style of supervising actually is. Because like I said, if it's hands-on or if it's hands-off, you need to work with what you're doing. And it's all well and good if you like that area of research, but if it doesn't work well with you, then it's not going to be too good. But specifically, speak to their current students. This is like one of the main things because their they will talk about themselves in a different way than they actually are. Talking to their current students, you will actually get a good angle of how you actually see them. When approaching them, make sure to show interest in the work. Don't send out generic emails because they hate that. They hate that so much.
What do you mean?
As in, don't just send out like, hey X, I find your work interesting. Would you want to supervise my project? You need to read some of the articles that they've done. Go specifically into their area of study. It can't be something that an email has been sent out to literally everyone that's just been copied and pasted. Because if it can apply to a bunch of supervisors, the academics will find out and they'll just be like, well, this person hasn't put any effort into actually picking a supervisor that's good. And so a lot of the time they just ignore it. It's from the experience that I've spoken to the supervisors that they just don't like when emails are just generic. You need to kind of look into their specific research areas.
Okay. And how do you find their students? That's another question I have.
Well, for me it's a little bit easier because they're all kind of listed on the Bristol website. Usually, you can probably find it on LinkedIn. You have to do a little bit of reconnaissance, I suppose, where you go around to the university, see who's doing the PhD projects in the university. If it's, for example, if you're looking for one in Exeter, it's going to be fairly easy because you just find them. It's although if you're because for me, I work on like a Slack channel, and so it's fairly easy to know. You can also just ask them, although I don't know how well they'd react to that. But yeah, I mean, I think the main kind of point is just to not send out generic emails. Because I remember hearing about this PhD that because their supervisor relationship was so bad that they didn't see their supervisor in 6 months and they failed their PhD. Which, if you fail your PhD, you get a master's, which is so funny. It's well, this is shit, but you gotta have something. You've been working 4 years on this. Going into the actual PhD experience, I've been talking to a few PhD students about this. And first is transitioning from master's to a PhD. This is largely because of the overlap between the two. So I think it's useful if you want to take a gap year, you should, because if you've got a master's dissertation that's being overrun, or you've got an extension on it, and it's overrunning into the PhD, that's absolutely something you want to avoid. Also, transitioning industry to academia, they're very different things. Like I was saying before, there's the more realistic approaches in industry, and sometimes academia can be a bit theory-wise, so you need to be a bit adaptable. Also, with a PhD, you're only doing it for 3 years, which is really not a lot of time to actually do this project, because first you need to know everything there is to know about your specific niche, and then you need to find out where there are flaws in the methodology, where there are research gaps, and then you will constantly be there'll be a lot of frustration in your time because you'll be continually, I'm not really selling it, but you'll be continually revising your work. Sometimes it's going to be large portions which you just have to remove and then replace, but it's all kind of part of the learning experience. Big part of it is also keeping organized. For a literature review, you absolutely need a reference management software. If not, then it just becomes a complete mess very, very quickly. Also, a more specific example, doing a PhD journal where every day you just write what you did that day in a Word document or something, just so when going back to experiences, because you've got a lot already, it can be difficult to remember all of them. So just going back, it can be genuinely very useful. It's really simple advice. There's also a big thing about going outside, making sure that there's such a big problem with welfare, and because of how independent of a project it is, it can be quite easily to isolate yourself. It's fine if you don't do that and you get involved with a lot of social events, but I think it's quite important to make sure you're not neglecting your friends at all. And also, it can be generally very useful to be social at conferences because, again, when you're trying to find those handful of people that actually know what you're doing, it's so good to be able to network with them and actually talk about their research and see what they actually want to see improved in their topic. So finally, I kind of want to talk a bit about responsible innovation. And this is essentially the idea that, you get to a point where you've worked so hard and you've gotten your area to a really good place. What happens when the growth is just completely unmanageable? So right now, there's this big extent of AI being completely unmanageable, and there's not enough regulations on it. There were a few years ago where, stuff like Uber was just it had the mentality of break things first, and then, I don't know if that's the right phrase, move fast and break things, meaning that it's not really being done responsibly. And the time between the initial level of high innovation to regulation is usually a really long amount of time. It's usually decades between that. And so when doing research, you always need to think about the ethical and societal issues and like anticipating these current risks. I remember when there was a development in the iPhone where they were trying to make the power more efficient in their batteries. They had like this researcher working on it, and they were like moving forward. And apparently, they found out later that like there was like it was the chemical that they were working with were very similar to like asbestos, which I don't know. And so it's kind of those things where those signs were there when he was developing that for his PhD, but he wasn't able to change the research, and he wasn't able to just stop doing it. And then, finally, when actually responsibly innovating, you have to engage with the public and like who's actually going to be affected by the consequences if your research does go very successfully. And finally, I just want to kind of recommend this YouTube video because this was what really got me excited for doing a PhD. This guy, he was a student at the University of Exeter from like 2016 to like 2018. Yeah. And he was a PhD student. And it really gives you, I think, an accurate representation of like how intense it can get, but also the reasons why you would want to do it. And in terms of just general resources, I think I'd also suggest just going onto the Exeter website as well, and searching for defining your PhD proposal. I realize I kind of went for a lot of information there, so I'll just kind of open it up for questions as well.
I mean, I have one. I was going to ask, what was your project? I don't know if you said earlier.
Oh, okay. So I'm doing a CDT, which essentially means I'm in the first year of it. So I don't necessarily have a project that I'm doing. I'm currently exploring certain research areas, and essentially I'm being tasked each week with researching specific scientific papers, doing assignments. Currently it's a little bit more, for me this year, more like a master's year, moving into a PhD. But it's not really called a master's, it's this whole joint thing. Yeah, I think for the most part I've kind of been collecting like information that I've heard from other PhD students on the program and stuff. But I'm very interested in looking more into the cybercrime. We recently had an assignment that was, it was essentially, like Silk Road?
Yeah.
Whereas like all the drug dealing marketplaces. So there was like 20 of the ones that got shut down, and they saved all of the forum logs of all of them. And so we had like a mini project where we're essentially tasked with analyzing the difference in speech patterns between the vendors on the different forums. So it was more of a qualitative analysis, but it was very interesting.
You did this already?
It was a mini project. It wasn't that big, to be fair. But we're essentially in the midst of defining our projects that we need to do for next year, but it's going to be intense next year because we've got a lot of master classes as well that we've got to do. And we've got an industry placement as well. I'd really recommend going for this this program specifically. But yeah.
What, the CPT?
Yeah, I mean, I think personally I really enjoy it. It's the ones at the University of Bristol and Bath. I think if you're interested in doing a cybersecurity degree, I mean, I'm very biased here, obviously, so I personally think it's great, especially if you want to go interdisciplinary between fields where there's the non-technical and the more social aspects. If you want to go into an area where it's a lot more mixed up, then this would be the program. If you're specifically going for more technical areas, suggest potentially there's some cyber physical programs. There's also just a lot of individual projects as well.
Thanks.
I'm still not quite sure what the impetus of doing a PhD would be. I mean, so Maxine the other day, for instance, was showing us some cybersecurity qualifications, OSP amongst other things.
Yeah, OCP and, for example, CPTS on like the box, things like that.
Well, like how it kind of compares to like professional
Well,
qualifications.
yes, so I mean, with those, the deals seem to be that you pay however many hundreds or in some cases thousands of pounds, you know. And
But
it's
you're getting
really
paid to do a
intensive,
PhD.
you know, maybe sort of 24 or 48 hours. And at the end of it, I was saying, like, what's the point? And he's saying, well, maybe you can sort of brandish this to an employer and say,
Yeah.
look, it's amazing, I got this thing, employ me, please, and give
Yeah.
me more money for it, and I can sort of be a member of a guild of people who have this qualification and such. Okay, so that versus a PhD.
Yeah.
Is the purpose of a PhD similarly to flaunt it to an employer and say, look how impressive I am?
Yeah, so I think there are a few reasons. I mean, specifically, the main point of doing a PhD, or a large point of it, not necessarily the full thing, because there's a lot of industry engagement as well, is if you wanted to go further into research as well. So you can get postdoc roles, and then you can kind of move your way up in that academic ladder, because that's the only place where a PhD is going to be absolutely necessary if you want to go for those sort of areas. Going into cybersecurity and industry, there is part of it where it's flaunting it, but I do think a PhD is very different from those degrees. And you do get to specialize in skills that other places you just wouldn't be able to get the resources for, especially if you don't necessarily have the money to get all these professional qualifications, but you're still really interested in this one field. Going into kind of the specific area for 4 years, it really develops these specialized skills that sometimes that can be harmful to a career, to be honest, because although it's not true, employers sometimes see PhDs as almost an overqualification for some jobs and an underqualification for others, which is kind of it's an annoying area where you're in. But also, more generally, I think there is a statistic on this where, like, on average, PhDs earn 15% more than undergraduates, but also that's masters earns 10% more on average, so you're doing an extra 3 years for like 5%. But then, on top of that, I think PhDs more generally, they can go for more senior roles because in their PhD sometimes they're looking at more of the organizational structure, and so they're able to look more generally at what an organization looks like and how it can be secure. So they may be more qualified than someone who's going into essentially the grunt work, going specifically into these systems. But then there's also, there's because doing a PhD, and especially cybersecurity, is such a wide range of things. There's not a specific career goal that you can gain from a PhD, but going into a specific topic with your PhD, you can, going into a specific topic, you can essentially figure out where this can lead. Like, for example, with cybercrime, for me, it kind of opens up new career paths with potentially more of like the intelligent agencies and the more, I don't think that's going to happen, but we'll see. But yeah.
So yeah, I think most probably a PhD would you would go out of a PhD having learned way more than you would with just a single certification, because I think the hardest certification you could pursue within a year. If you take a year off, you dedicate a whole year to this certification, even if it's complicated, I think you could probably pass it. And PhD wise, like Charles says, it's 4 years, diverse research topics, so you're gonna learn probably way more studying a degree, a longer degree, and a more academic degree than a specific certification.
It strikes me that the only way to get good at cybersecurity is by doing cybersecurity, capture the flag challenges, programming,
Yeah.
etc. And sort of abstracting yourself from you're actually seeing that in work and doing some theoretical abstract research.
It really depends what you want to do, because I feel like in a field like cryptography, you would be very good in cryptography if you do math and you really stay on the academic path.
That's the thing, I wanted to start doing cryptography, but it's kind of too high of a barrier of entry,
Yeah.
where I can't do it in a year to learn like all of this maths.
ECDSA and all this.
What was it?
The elliptic curve
Oh,
digital
fuck.
signatures algorithm.
Yeah, fuck that shit.
It's fascinating, but yeah, it's a bummer.
Yeah,
I asked Ashim Hakim to come by and give a talk on cryptography.
Mhm.
Hopefully as time soon. We'll see, but yeah, he's definitely, none of us would be able to give a proper talk on cryptography. It's definitely a way too complicated subject, so we'll see when he does that. But yeah, I think some subjects in cyber would be better when you do hands-on practice, and would be better by just practicing and doing like in real life scenarios. But other like cryptography or more academic matters would probably be better in the mood.
That's interesting.
Right. Speaking of curves, how's the transition from like final year of uni to PhD?
Oh, for me it was quite stressful, because I think it's more so my individual circumstances, but for my program I needed specific grades, so I needed a first class degree, so it was conditional to actually get in September. So I was stressing so much in that final year to like be able to, because I felt confident that I could get it, but it was not 100% thing. And then in the summer I was doing an internship as well. So in a sense I kind of regret not being able to do a lot of pre-learning for it. For an individual project PhD, so that's not the one I'm on, I imagine it's going to be a little bit more stressful because you're essentially going into this project which you need to essentially learn independently. If you haven't been working much over the summer, then it's going to be really difficult to transition into just reading a lot of literature reviews every day. I spoke to this one person who's doing a PhD in mathematics, and he's finding it really difficult to actually do work. Like he says, I'm taking a lot of personal days, I'm reading some papers, but it can be quite difficult sometimes. And I think that's kind of the area where he was doing a master's last year, he took time off in the summer, and then he's essentially going into it, and he's having to talk to his supervisor, and at some point the consequence is going to get to him, but it's not at this point. And so hopefully, but I think you do fairly quickly get into the swing of things,
Right, and you mentioned emailing professors. Is there a formal application process, or do you just?
I mean, there is. For predefined projects, there are usually. But sometimes, honestly, you can get more success because professors are pretty used to having emails. As long as you're actually showing interest in their work, they won't mind. I think the more formal way to do it can sometimes be a little bit more like you get lost in the weeds a bit, whereas you don't always get seen by the professors. And you can't, there may be a project that a professor finds interesting that isn't necessarily listed on the website. So I kind of recommend reaching out to them directly, because they also just get a sense of your personality and what your work ethic might necessarily be, rather than an application form, which can sometimes just be a bit too formal, I suppose. But yeah, is that it? Or
if God willing, you get to the end of this PhD after potentially 3 or 4 years or whatever,
Yeah.
you insistently and proudly use DR in front of your
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. Dr. Charles Mann, PhD. No,
a PhD, just in case by the time they've read through your 2 names, they've forgotten. Just at the end as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, I told all my friends, like, when I graduate, you need to start calling me doctor. They said they'll only call me doctor once, which I feel,
So it's a bit. Come on, 4 years, only
Yeah,
once.
come on. This is why I'm doing this.
Okay, cool. You guys have any more questions?
Right. Yeah, actually.
Oh, yeah.
How much latitude did they give you with your own project?
So with the project, once you actually got into a specific project, are you talking about the time before where you're kind of figuring out what you want to do?
Let's go with time before.
Okay.
In the field, how much latitude do you have with defining your own?
I mean, currently, so for me personally, it's because it's interdisciplinary, they want me to consider both the social and technical aspects, but also essentially anything that I'm being taught currently, whether or not that be cryptocurrency scams, like phishing emails, even like actually analyzing the sentiment of specific phishing emails, like what their tactics are. That could be like a valid area for me. But then I can also, if I'm capable of doing that, I can also go into very technical areas with doing industrial control systems and operational technology security. Stuff which is going to essentially have no social leaning. So I essentially have like full range. As long as I can claim it's cybersecurity, and as long as I can find a professor that has the same interest as me, because that's not, if there's no professor that can supervise, then the project is kind of dead on arrival, because no one's going to be able to actually help me if they don't know more than me. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of lateral movement I can do, but it's confined to what people can help me with, essentially. Like, what are the research interests of other people? Yeah.
I was just wondering, what does it mean to be supervised?
Oh yeah, so a supervisor is essentially, you've got this like massive project right over like 4 years, and a supervisor is essentially can perform different roles, but it's mostly just to guide you to a point where you can submit your project. So it's like if you had like a dissertation, you'll also have a supervisor. Are you in like second or first?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's going to be different for you. But like once you get to third year, you kind of get it where you have meetings with a supervisor each week to see where your progress is along your project, kind of push you in the right direction, read up on your project and say like, oh, this is complete shit, and then like write it back up again. Because there's so many areas of research that at the start of the PhD journey, you just won't know any of. Like currently I'm really terrible at like researching, or not researching, but just writing in general, because I'm being pushed currently to like write better, but it's not one of my skills, and so hopefully by the end of the PhD, the constant like pushing from my supervisor will help me refine my project and refine my research skills. So it's mostly just a refinement of project and skills.
Is that your project just an essay? Is that like a dissertation?
So it's similar to a dissertation, but it's a lot more deep into the subject. So it's essentially like, I think it's like 100 pages. It's composed of a literature review, and then you have to do like a fuck ton of experiments. You have to consider the ethics and like social impacts of it. And so it's just this massive document where you have to essentially just consider everything. In a sense, it's a bit like an essay, but it's a lot more like a proper science experiment, you know, if you can call it that in cybersecurity, I suppose. But it's just, you have to just explore everything essentially within your very specific niche.